Uh, to provide people a little bit of a warning, the last time Alexis and I saw each other was at the Champions League Final Four in 2015, right?
That was a
Um,
5 year 5 year anniversary a few days ago, I think, or a week or two ago.
oh, so yeah, pretty
I got a
close.
pop-up message.
Um,
But
oh yeah, did you?
yeah.
I wonder if I saw that. Um, but to let people know, we basically sat down while the teams were doing their day before serve and pass session, and I don't remember if all of them did it back to back. Mark's team may not have done it. Berlin may not have done it at that point, but I think the other
Mm.
ones did. And we talked all the way through all of them, and basically didn't realize it was. I mean, we knew volleyball was going on behind us, but we just kind of didn't stop talking until Mark came over and was like,
Yeah.
"We're done. You
I remember that. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So we'll try not to get carried away. Uh, all right. You're coming at this from an interesting perspective in that you've been in both the worlds of gymnastics and volleyball. So I'd like to start just for you to give people an idea of what those two things are kind of bringing into this discussion from your experience.
I wanted to first define the terms, because I think one of the problems that we often have is everyone's definition of different terms is slightly different. So if I say something definitive about the way I define something that might be wrong on your definition, we don't actually disagree. It's just that we define things slightly differently. So for me, when I talk about performance, in the world that I live in, which is high performance sport, which has been fortunate to work in for most of my adult life, high performance sport means trying to win gold medals at the Olympics. So that's the outcome, and everything that you do is defined by that goal, which is basically impossible to do. Like, for example, there are a lot more billionaires in the world than there are Olympic gold medalists. But that's the outcome that you're looking for. So that's what, when I say performance, that's what I mean. And when it gets to sort of elite club stuff in Europe or South America, then that's kind of similar, but still different to the world that I live in. And development is, when I talk about development, I'm talking about aiming for that. So it's, what do I do 10 or 15 years prior to work towards that person achieving a gold medal in the future? And it's one of the real challenges that I have is that with good development, the best thing for them to do today in order to achieve a gold medal 10 years from now might be to stay home and study. Right? It doesn't mean that you need to fill their lives full of as many possible hours of training as you can. So performance and development are those two things. And development is generally with children. I work in gymnastics now, so children means 5 years onwards, and adult means for adult women's gymnastics means 16, but really it's more or less a sliding scale upwards of about 5 years for volleyball. So juniors is anything from 10 onwards, and adults are anything from 18, 20, whatever. So I just wanted to define that from the beginning, so that was clear. So to get back to your question in terms of gymnastics and volleyball, one of the things that is really important in gymnastics is systematic development. So everything is very, very much about building blocks. So you learn a forward roll so that you can then do a forward roll with something else. So it's everything is just about stacking one on top of the other. So you're constantly building up skills, building more and more complex skills, building more and more complex routines. And so that isn't something really that we think about in volleyball. but I found it really interesting and it immediately made a lot of sense to me. So, for example, in gymnastics, when I worked in Australia, we had a grid for women's gymnastics. There were, I think, 419 skills, and it went through what year you should master every one of those skills. So when you're 5, there are 4 skills that you needed to master. When you're 6, you needed to have done the first 4 plus another 5. And so it was very much gradual progression, gradual build of skills looking towards what is going to be required as an adult. And the biggest thing for that is that the competitions were structured in the same way. So in competition, the things that were in compulsory routines in competition fit along that same timeline. And that's where volleyball is so completely different, because with the odd variation in rules, you're basically playing with exactly the same rules. You can do anything that you want in exactly the same way as adults can from when you first start playing. So that's where the influence of competition into that development process makes things so much more complicated and makes people think that performance and development is a dichotomy. And so the whole idea of this topic is to go into the idea that it actually you can do both at the same time.
Okay. Just going back to your definitions, to get the performance side at the adult level, those are athletes who are in teams that are, as you said, intentionally trying to go for a gold medal, or whatever their capability is as a nation. Highest possible.
No, gold medal. No, that's the goal. Seriously, that's absolutely 100%. So in Singapore is no different to Australia, is no different to USA. That's the goal. The chances of achieving that goal is basically 0. But having that goal informs all of your decisions along the way. That's a really important part. You don't lower the goal because it's less likely.
Okay, so then by that definition, if we're going to be strict on that definition, there are countries who, despite playing at the international level, are effectively not performance programs because they do not have a go for the gold ambition.
Yes.
Fair? I think we need to put out a list, but we could probably all think of a few off the top of our heads if we wanted to. Okay, yes. Now, as for the kids, at what stage do you consider them to have gone from just, I guess, participation into the performance pipeline, so to speak?
Good question. I think when they get involved in a program that has that outcome in mind is the simplest answer. So if they let's say they're playing at school, they become involved in some sort of program that is working towards high performance outcomes. And you can be working towards high performance outcomes when you're 10. And that doesn't mean that you're learning, that you're training 30 hours a week. That just means that you're being taught technical competency, and in volleyball you're being taught technical competency appropriate to your age, and maybe some rough structural or systematic things. I'm so far from an expert on coaching 10-year-olds, it's not funny. But the point isn't that you don't have to be teaching something that an adult expert knows to be on the performance pathway. There's one of my favorite lines is, I hope this story actually happened, but I doubt it. And it's the story I heard was about the parent of a under 10 soccer team, and went up and showed the coach a video of a training and said, see, this is what the Brazilian national team do. Maybe we should do this. And the coach said, I'd rather see what the Brazilian national team were doing when they were 10 years old. So we keep in our race. Sorry.
So that was a good story. Yeah. I think I've heard that one before.
Yeah. So in our race for the bottom, we think that higher level at a younger age is good. It's not necessarily good. Like I said, maybe the best thing for them to do is to, if there's a talented 15-year-old who's really stressed about school, maybe the best thing to do, and I've seen this happen, is for that child to get told, you know what, just come to training when you can. You don't have to tell me, just come to training when you can for the next month, rather than worrying about balancing everything. That might be the best thing for that person. To me, that's high performance behavior, whereas telling everyone that they have to come to every session, otherwise that they'll be punished, that's actually about short-term outcomes, not long-term outcomes.
Okay. We actually got a question just that was part of clarifying in terms of high performance, and they were wondering about saturation in certain countries, whether that's affects them. So the way it's being phrased is, in the U.S., every state has 10 plus clubs. Go to Texas and it's more like 1,000. Mm-hmm. Not every state brings high-level athletes to the same area. So sometimes high performance, meaning the high performance program, I assume the USA volleyball program, passes up a quality athlete.
Yeah.
The final thing is, does that make sense? But what I was going to suggest there is, it sounds like the definition of high performance or performance pathway for a young player is more about attitude and intention and less about the formal structure that they may happen to be in at the time.
Yes, absolutely. I thought you were going to go in the opposite direction with that, John, and I was getting ready. I was already preparing my answer. But no, intention is the critical factor, intention. So I used to tell people, everyone that I worked with when I was working one of my jobs in Australia, that the best high performance centre in the country was a fairly small club in the middle of nowhere in Sydney, because the way they went about things was very, very much with the intention of long-term gold medals. Right? That was everything was informed by that. And there's been plenty of programs that I've seen that have coaches wearing high performance on their shirts and high performance signs on the doors that don't actually operate as high performance programs. When I say plenty, that's unfair, but certainly happens. So it's not about the sign on the door. It's not about the badge on the shirt. It's about the mentality and the intent. So that informs, I keep saying, informs your decisions along the way.
So just for the American viewers, basically what we're saying here is, okay, yes, USA volleyball with the national teams are clearly going for gold medals. Nobody's going to dispute that. That yes. Does not necessarily mean that the high performance program that encapsulates the youth players is strictly all about going for gold medals. In some cases, hardly at all.
Sorry, what high performance programs are they?
The USA Volleyball has a high performance program. What do they call a high performance program? They have tryouts for it.
Yes.
At the national level and also at the regional level. But it's kind of every summer sort of thing. So it's not a consistent program.
Yeah.
So you can definitely make a case that it's part of USA Volleyball, but it isn't really properly a high performance program, at least in certain respects.
Look, I think, and many countries have those things. So if it's not a centralized, or it doesn't have to be centralized, but if it's not a focused center with some sort of national direction and national oversight that's training regularly, and I know America doesn't have that. Those high performance programs that you're talking about are probably the best option. They're about, and this is a big part of my job over the last 10 plus years, is they're about engagements. They're about engaging the athletes, creating something that people want to be a part of that's higher than what they currently are in, and finding out who those athletes are. And then everything else kind of either looks after itself or doesn't, but you don't really have any impact on them other than bringing them together and introducing them to their peers and creating some sort of internal competitiveness, getting people to see what the standards are, and hopefully in sort of training camps you might have, hopefully raising the bar. The problem that happens is when you try to use those, whatever it is, a 2-week training camp once a year, maybe, you try to use that to influence the technical capacity of the athletes, because that's just ludicrous. So one of the things that, getting back to gymnastics, one of the things that happens in gymnastics is that there's a really close relationship between the coach and the athlete. So anyone who gets invited to any national kind of camp, training camp, or even regional, any sort of high level, the coach comes too. In fact, the athlete can't come without the coach. So as soon as I discovered this in gymnastics, it was just so exciting, because it means, okay, now we actually have the opportunity to influence the athlete every day in training. Because what you do every day in training determines what you improve on. Right? So if someone learns a new technique for 2 weeks in summer and then goes home and no one, and their club coach and their high school coach never mentioned it again, then you've just wasted probably $2,500 on a 2-week camp. But if the coaches come and learn the same things as the athletes and learn how to teach that and learn how to coach better, then you can actually start to create something, because then they go home and then those same coaches influence not just the 2 good kids that they had who got invited to the camp, but all of the rest of the ones in their club or in their school. And so that's when you really start to build some momentum in terms of high performance development.
Okay. As you talked about how pretty clearly structured it is in gymnastics with, okay, this year at this age, these skills, the next year, these skills, and so on and so on. Volleyball doesn't exactly lend itself quite so readily. So how do you adjust for that?
The adjustment is from planning ahead. So I was on Volleyball Coaches and Trainers this morning, and someone posted a question which I thought was really interesting, and it comes up all the time. And the question is, what is the most important skill in volleyball? And there's many answers to this question. The answer is not passing, just for anyone out there. There's many answers to this question, but the most important one says that it's different over time. Right? The most important skill for winning beginner volleyball is serving, obviously, clearly. It is the easiest skill to do by a long, long way, and it requires one touch in a closed system, it's a closed skill. Right? So serving is clearly the most important skill to win in beginner, junior, low-level volleyball. The next step to stop that is you have to be good at passing. So for you to stop losing to teams that are good servers, you actually have to, there's a point at which you can't just be a better serving team than the other team. Because in all levels, we're always dealing with roughly homogeneous groups. So there's a point at which you have to decide, okay, I'm going to need to teach our kids to pass now, because the ball needs to not be an ace. If we can keep it alive and get it back, then it becomes a game of skill, not a game of serving. Once you get past that, then the next thing is, okay, so the ball's in the air. we can choose to keep the ball alive until the other team messes up, or we can choose to try and kill the ball ourselves. And that's when hitting becomes the most important. Right? So different things are more important at different levels. Right? Now, the problem is passing is really, really hard. Hitting is really, 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 really hard. Serving is really easy. So you actually have to start those things at the same time. It's just that you're not going to get good at hitting for 4 or 5 years. And so this is the difference between development and trying to gain a competitive advantage as a junior. If your focus is on long-term development, then you will teach them to serve, pass and hit. And you'll focus on different things slightly differently, because you can't actually learn to hit until your players can pass the ball in the air and keep it alive. But you need to start those things at the same time, because they will take different periods of time to get good at. And if you're thinking of that, then we get into drill design. Drill design is really easy, because now you're not just getting everyone to line up on the baseline and hit the ball as hard as they can over the air, over the net for serving practice, because you know you have to get good at passing. So now you're going to have passers in there. And you know you're going to need a setter eventually, once you can pass the ball towards in a vague direction. Or maybe you think when we pass, the ball has to go in the air somewhere. Anyone's probably going to have to set this, so I may as well teach everyone to set a ball to the outside. And okay, well, seeing as we're setting to the outside, then we may as well have some hitters there and we can work on hitting. And all of a sudden you've got drills which are developmental drills, not competition performance drills.
Okay, there we go.
Mm-hmm. Did that answer any question apart from what?
Yeah. It's the importance of developing at different levels is an obvious one, but at the same time, maybe not one that people give a lot of thought to. And partly because, for better or for worse, coaches oftentimes don't have players for that long. So whoever
Yes.
your coach is for a 10-year-old probably won't be the same coach as a 14-year-old.
Yes.
So that's a bit of a flaw. I mean, I don't know if you want to call it a flaw or not, but it's a factor.
The only flaw there is that the coach who has the athletes for 1 year thinks that because I don't have them next year, I don't need to worry about what they can do when I hand them on. That's where the flaw comes in. But look, it's a real... I get that it's a real thing. It frustrates me, but I get that it's a real thing. And because I've spent a lot of my time working in the area where you want people to be coaching the athletes who come to you with long-term goals in mind, then I think it's really important. But also, coaches are generally competitive by nature, and that's part of the attraction. So if we want coaches to be volunteering to coach, then they need to be able to do things that interest them. And also in some situations, it's their livelihood. And so if you aren't winning, then you might not have a job next year, which again is why the topic and why I specifically asked you to capitalise the "and," which is why I talked about performance and development. You actually can do both. And the way you do both is, again, it's about if you're focusing on long-term development, training, you can then do things in games and you can actually be more creative. You can be more competitive. You can do more different things in competition if you've developed more athletes with more skills. And that actually helps you. And it helps you be more adaptive to be able to counter what other teams are doing. But it's harder. It's a higher bar. And so the challenge is to get coaches to realise it's worthwhile and to think about the long-term development of the children who are in their care. And I always talk about them being children, not athletes, because just because a coach of an under-12s team wants to win doesn't mean that the athletes even really care. Some of them do, some of them don't, but they're there because they want to have fun. And so it is possible to do both, but it definitely starts at training. So if you're coaching children for a short season and you only coach things that they might have to do in a game, then that's when you know things aren't on track.
Yeah. And of course, we always have the complexity of parent engagement sort of thing.
That's
just to add another layer of challenge to everything we've got going on.
Okay. I'll give you a story. There's a coach I worked with in gymnastics, and he was a former national team level men's gymnast from America. And he ended up in this random tiny little club in a small town in Australia. But his kids were good. And so they started coming to camps that I was running. So I got to know him a bit, and I went out and visited his camp. And so I talked to him about the real challenge in gymnastics in particular, but it's really comparable to volleyball, is whether to focus on technical development or competition results. And he was clearly focusing on technical development. And I said to him, so why do you think it's so important? And he said, well, that's how I was brought up in the American system, that the long-term technical development is the priority. I said, okay, well, how do you balance that with competition results? Because if you focus more on technical development, then you're not going to focus as much on competition, so the results will suffer. So how do you handle that with parents? And he said, I tell them that that's what I'm doing. I said, that's surprisingly simple. But then he immediately followed up by saying, but the good thing for me is there aren't any other clubs anywhere near here, so the parents don't have a choice if they don't like it. But it's also, it's not...
That does make a difference.
But that's okay too. I think I find it very hard to speak. I'm not a parent, but I think there's lots of parents out there who would think that looking after the long-term development of athletes is something that they'd prefer to watching, to only focusing on winning some game every week or doing well in some tournament every 2 weeks. I actually think there's a lot of people that would be fine with that. And the people that wouldn't be fine with that, they can go somewhere else. That's okay. And this again is a truth, a reality. This is a fact. It's not a theory. I know of programs, I have friends that run programs where people come to the program and parents come to the program and stay with the program because they know that their children will get looked after. They know that their long-term development, they know that their physical development will be good so they don't get injured in the same sort of way that many others do. They know that they will be well-rounded. They know that their mental and emotional development will be looked after, and they come to the program because of that. So it's not... and if you are open and honest about that and say, in our program, your child will play, right? That means that sometimes someone else is going to be on the court and that your child is better than, because they need to play too. And that's how it's going to work. And if you don't like that, then that's completely fine. And maybe this isn't for you, but these are the reasons why we do it, because of all of the evidence that tells you that multi-skilling is good, that different experiences is good, that all of the evidence that tells you why junior athletes quit, none of it is related to whether or not they won. all of the information that comes about long-term athlete development and people staying in sport. So all of it is rational and logical and is backed up by research. It's just somehow counterintuitive. So we think that if you win, then you're happy, especially with children, and that's not necessarily the case. So again, I'm not sure if that was a question or just answer to a question or just
in volleyball. You know, when you have the parent equation,
yeah,
it's fine. In volleyball, we have a couple of things that are going on that influence some of the challenges that we have with kids, and relating it to parents. And you're in a good position to talk about the differences in the motor learning aspect of gymnastics versus volleyball, because they're extremely different from that perspective. But a lot of parents don't know what good training looks like.
Yeah.
So they have an expectation of what they think it looks like, which is usually kind of block drilled oriented, because maybe that's what they got when they were kids in their own sports career, if they were that. And then the other side of it is going 6v6 quite early on in the cycle, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds.
That's ludicrous.
It would be a much better scenario for everybody if they were playing 4v4 or even 2v2, whatever, something much more small-sided.
Yeah.
But some people, and I was in a conversation at the AVCA convention in December, and I brought this up, Doug Beal, in this open kind of international conversation. And, I said, Doug, I know Don Kessel has pushed, go small-sided for the little ones, for he's been doing that for years and years and years. But yet USA Volleyball still runs 6v6 12s for junior nationals, for national qualifiers and all that. And all the regions run that, obviously, because that's what USAV does. I said, Doug, how come there isn't a push to go 4v4 or something smaller for the younger kids? And basically his argument was an argument based on fear, which I can't stand, but the argument was people don't think that's real volleyball.
Yeah.
So parents will go to another organization where they do play 6-on-6 real volleyball, and we'll lose them for USA. Like I said, that's fear-based. I don't like it, but also, again, it's the other side of the reflection of do people even really kind of get what is optimal for their kids at those younger age groups?
Well, firstly, most coaches don't. So to expect that the parents do is, I'm sorry, it's just true. And I mean, honestly, I've been doing this for 30 odd years, and it's only been in the last 5 years that I've got a much, much better understanding of those younger ages. I guess most people, like most coaches, I started off coaching kids because that's who you're allowed to coach when you're starting off. And then I assumed, like most coaches, that to go the higher level means older and older athletes, and then you end up coaching adults. And then actually started going back downwards in terms of ages again, and realized, actually I much, much prefer this, because I really like the teaching side of things. And I guess one of the things about coaching with a development focus is there's not the same sort of time pressure. So you've got time to get things right. So someone asked me once, so how long should I, in my annual plan, how long should I periodize passing? I said, well, you can't play until you can pass, so you should periodize it until you can do it, which is not what you would do if you were trying to win a tournament at the end of June. So the question was about parents. People don't understand, but that's when you can explain to them. And there'll be ups and downs, and completely rational people, completely rational parents will get upset because their child is upset, and that's normal and that's to be expected. But in terms of the American system, the biggest challenge that you have there is that the solution for that is that everyone supports, is that you're clear about what you're doing from the beginning, that you're supporting the coach so the coach has the skills to do it, and that when there's complaints, you're supporting the coach. And from the various threads that you follow on VCT from time to time, it seems that not all clubs and not all schools and not all colleges have the capacity to do that, because it's really hard, right? Because coaches, sometimes you're trying to find coaches, they might still be playing themselves. They don't know how to deal with parents. So just because you say that we have this system doesn't mean they can run it. And the people that run clubs, some of them have the capacity to deal with conflict and some of them don't. I mean, that's just the reality. So there's breakdowns at every part of that chain. But the clearer you are in terms of your club philosophy or in terms of your school philosophy, the more open you are with parents about this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is how it's going to look, then people will be okay with it. You'll be able to explain it. So someone says, why was Debbie not on the court? Debbie wasn't on the court because of this. This is the reasons. 6 months ago when you joined this club, this is what we said would happen. This is an example of it happening. This is what will happen next week. And so it doesn't seem as, I guess to parents, it doesn't seem as random. It doesn't seem like you're victimizing their child or that you're doing the wrong things. No, this is what I'm doing and this is why I'm doing it. And to do that well requires a very high level of skill, competence from all of the people in that path, including the parents. But with developmental coaching, usually the youngest, least experienced coaches are in those roles, and that's always a challenge. Are you there? You've stopped moving, John. All right. I'm not sure. John, you've frozen on me. So maybe I'll keep talking, and to I guess continue about the idea of competition.
You still hear me, Alexis? Yeah, same with your screens are frozen. Well, at least the audio's going through.
All right. So you're frozen, but I can hear you now. Okay, now I'm the host apparently. I'm not sure what that means, but now I'm the co-host and John's back. All right. You there, John?
You co-host the whole time, but yeah, I'm back.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so where did you get to?
You were just about to go further on the idea of competition.
Okay.
But actually, you could do that, but we also had somebody toss in a comment / question.
Sure.
It was the idea of one of the challenges with younger kids. They were talking about 10 to 12 for volleyball, but I'm sure it applies for even earlier, like with gymnastics, is that because kids are growing, and in volleyball, the scale of net height and balls and things like that changes. There becomes a change in the required skill as they progress, and get older and bigger and stronger and all that sort of stuff.
No, there doesn't. Any other questions? No, the skill doesn't change. The skill doesn't change. So as people develop, as people's size and shape changes, then the way they do things, it will adapt automatically. So once they become stronger, so once they're as tall as they're going to be, then they start becoming stronger, then things will change as well. As they grow, things will change. It always puzzles me when people talk about teaching people to do the same thing. So, well, everyone's different. So there's all sorts of different ways that will be successful. And I've had this argument with my brother about 1,000 times. There's all sorts of things that will be successful, right? So let's say arbitrarily there are 100 different things that can be successful in terms of, let's say, passing. So there are 100 different ways that you can pass successfully, right? But if you accept that there are 100 different ways, then there are also 1,000,000 different ways that you will never, ever, ever be able to pass successfully, right? So the job of the coach isn't to teach everyone to do exactly the same thing. The job of the coach is to teach technical competence. So it's making sure that that technically there's nothing they do that will limit them in the future. Right? It's not to teach technical perfection. Technical perfection is it's just ludicrous. And I was at a presentation by the head of the Australian Ballet once, and her presentation was about difference. And so she put up the 3 best ballet dancers in the history and then pointed out all of the reasons why they should never have been successful. So this flexibility in this was no good, the arms to leg ratio was no good, and just picked apart all of the reasons why the best 3 dancers ever should never have been successful. But they all evolved. But I bet they were still all taught the same, 6 positions. And I can't remember. I don't know as much about ballet as other people. But the idea is technical competence. So to get back to that. So the original question was that your technique changes as you grow. So, yeah, but if maybe other coaches are better than me, but if I'm teaching 12-year-olds to hit, right, they don't all look the same. I'm not nearly a good enough coach to coach everyone to look exactly the same. Everyone looks completely different. And all I'm doing is trying desperately to correct things that are limiting. So, for example, they don't use their arms to jump as high as they can. So they just run straight in with their arms at their side. Now, that is obviously counterproductive to hitting. So, yes, there's lots of different ways to hit, but no one hits without swinging their arms to get their arms up above their head. So that's about technical competence. Thoracic rotation. Some people, some of the best hitters in the world don't rotate their shoulders much when they hit. But there's still an advantage. It gives you more flexibility with the sort of positions that you might be able to play as you're developing. So we work on thoracic development. Everyone's different, and everyone's level of ability in that impacts their spiking technique. But technical competence, if they can't rotate, they can't rotate, right? It doesn't mean that we don't work on that and work on their ability to rotate, because there is a long-term advantage to that. So as the athlete develops, the athlete's technique will change. And the coach of a 12-year-old teaching hitting for the first time, the fundamentals of it are just really basic. And they're not going to be so locked into that after 6 months of training that they're never going to be able to adjust when they grow 3 inches next year, right? It's just not how the body works. So it's not about teaching different techniques at different times. It's about teaching good fundamentals and then tweaking things, and then the body will change, and so the athlete will change because their body is different, and so they'll start doing different things. Some of them might be good, some of them might be counterproductive, so then you tweak again and you tweak again. Yeah.
All right, just the clarification that came up with this question/statement. It speaks to something that John Kessel talks about in terms of the disadvantage of young players playing on an adult court, and how he's shown examples of if you took the ratios of net height, court size, et cetera, and you tried to put adult players on something that was similarly big, it would be this gigantic, huge court. I think there's actually video of it. Somebody trying to do it. So the question is more about the demands of the skill are different. The demands of the player are different when they're little because the scale of the game for them is very different. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And look, I've heard the argument before about how I think the first time it was told to me by someone that was quite close to John was Marie Louise hits this high above the net, so therefore for 13-year-olds the net should be this high so that they can hit this high above the net as well. And I think there's huge flaws with that argument, but there's a certain logic to it as well. In Australia, usually net heights lower for younger ages to a certain extent. There's I think a big part of it also comes back to what you're teaching, right? So if I'm teaching, I don't know, but I suspect anyone teaching hitting doesn't only teach hitting on the height net that they compete at off a set or off a toss or whatever, right? There'll be times when they'll be working on arm swing stuff specifically. So standing on the ground, tossing it to yourself, hitting it to a partner, hitting against the wall, those sorts of things, right? So the height of the net has an impact in competition, but it doesn't have to have an impact when you're teaching, right? But also, when you're hitting at the highest level, you hit the ball in different places, in different positions. You find ways to get the ball over the net and into particular parts of the court. So you're learning to be adaptable. You're learning self-awareness, court awareness, ball awareness. I'm below the height of the net. I need to hit the ball up to get it over. And that's going to happen sometimes. So the mechanics of hitting a ball from below the height of the net over the net are different, but the difference can be sort of 1 foot different behind your head, or not even 1 foot, half a foot different behind your head. So instead of hitting the ball slightly in front of your shoulder, you're hitting the ball slightly behind your shoulder. That's the only difference it has to be, right? And so in terms of teaching children who can't play volleyball or who aren't very well skilled, the technical competence, I don't see it as the fact that they're growing. I don't see that as a reason to change anything in terms of what you're teaching, because the outcome is still what defines what you need to do, and athletes need to work out how to get the outcomes that are required, and that's part of their learning. With the technique that a coach teaches is designed to help them get to the outcome, but the outcome they have to own. They're the only ones that are playing the ball. Did that answer that? Or have you frozen again? Oh, there you are.
The outcome, yeah, I think so. No, I'm still here. The outcome thing is actually something that came up in the discussion between Tim Alanis and Lauren Anderson last week in terms of coaches perhaps not giving enough attention or not getting the players to give enough attention to what is it you're actually trying to accomplish as you work on the skill. It's not just about, I'm trying to accomplish putting my arm here or my foot there. It's like, well, why are you doing this? So I wanted to get your thoughts on things like smash ball or bounce rules or catch and toss type adjustments that are made in different places to the game at the young levels?
I don't know what smash ball is.
It's basically low enough net that people can legitimately spike over.
No, I'm not a fan. I mean, volleyball is a jumping game. If you lower the net so that people don't have to jump, then it's counterproductive. And I'm not saying there's always going to be the taller players who don't have to jump, and there is in senior as well, but at least they had to jump when they were younger. So they've actually learned how to jump. So I don't really know what that is, but it sounds like it might be fun to do from time to time. But I'm not sure about that. What were the other things you mentioned?
When I was in Sweden, at a certain level, they let the ball bounce. There are other variations where maybe you can allow for a catch somewhere along the way.
Look, I've had more exposure to coaching, had a tiny bit of exposure to coaching beginners in the last 4 years, and to dealing with young kids in the last sort of 5 or 6 years. But I'm far from an expert on how to teach volleyball. I used to get asked, even recently, to run some things of kids that can't play, and I wouldn't even know where to start. So I know that I've done stuff where the ball's allowed to bounce with it. I mean, to me, it's all volleyball though. It's a weird thing. So I grew up learning about coaching from a game sense perspective. Right, so teaching games for understanding, game sense. So to me, that was normal. Everything was 100% normal. It turned out that the lecturers that I had at uni were amongst the first sort of half dozen people in the world to start writing books about this stuff. But I didn't know that at the time. Right? So to teach volleyball, okay, when you're starting off, you can't use 3 hits. It's impossible. So you break it down. Okay, so the first one you can catch, because ultimately you're teaching the idea of 3 hits, the system, okay, the movement off the ball. And so you can slow it down by letting it bounce, by catching. Then you progress, okay, you can catch every one of them. Then you progress it so that you actually have to hit the third one over, so you can catch and throw the first 2. Then you progress it. Then you start make the court bigger. Then you add more people, all of those things. That's just common sense. I mean, so I don't know about having competitions with those things, but I mean, that to me is how you would train volleyball. I mean, I don't know any other way to do it.
Okay. All right. You before I dropped off, you were going to start having a discussion about competition. Remember where you were going to go with that?
So to get back to the topic of sort of long-term performance and development, and the part of the development is outcome. So outcome is important. While you're developing, here's a great example. So I worked with a guy who was he actually wrote basically a manifesto. He wrote a parent's handbook. He said, "This is how I'm going to run the program." And he said, and he had his plans. So for his competitions, he would have plans. And one of the basic plans was that, let's say he had 9 players, right? And 3 of them were really good, 3 of them were okay, 3 of them were pretty bad, right? So then he stated in his parents' manual that fundamentally what would happen is that 2 of the 3 really good ones would be on the court, 2 of the 3 middle ones would be on the court, 2 of the 3 bad ones would be on the court. That'd be their 6 players. They'd be oriented in such a way that you'd get the most out of that grouping, right? And then the next set, different players would be the same sort of roles. Next set, different players would be the same sort of roles. So he clearly defined going into, before the competition had even started, how he was going to structure games, right? So then, And again, this is his personal structure, again, with the full support of the club. So then in competition, you try to win, right? But you win within those constraints. Usually the only constraints in competition are the rules of the game, but coaches can have their own constraints as well. And the ridiculous is harsh. The thing most coaches assume is that, well, at the highest level, they don't play with any constraints. So why should I? Because that's what I want. That's what I'm aspiring to. The highest level, they have huge constraints. Coaches who are coaching the best players in the world have huge constraints all the time. Volleyball Nations League is you play 3 games. Was it 3 games a week for 8 weeks? Right. So Volleyball Nations League is about and this is obviously the best countries, the best players in the world, but it's still generally about putting the worst team on the court that you can to win any given match, so that you can save the freshness of your very best players for the really big games, right? And it's a constant balance of, okay, I need to rest that person. They can't play 3 games in a weekend because they're physically broken from their club season. So there's all sorts of constraints that coaches at the highest levels have. And it's assumed that they don't, but they do. So whatever constraints that you have when you're coaching developmental athletes, you can place them on yourself. It's fine. As long as there's a good reason, and if you're consistent with it, then people understand and it works well. I was coaching a team at national championships once, a beach volleyball team, and this is, what were they, 15, 16-year-old kids. So this is probably their 2nd national championships, maybe. And the constraints I put on myself was, this is beach volleyball, so you're not allowed to yell out during games, which I love. I love the fact that players actually just get to play and make their own decisions. But you're allowed to talk to them in timeouts or between sets. And so the constraints I put on myself were that the first thing I would do is I would let them talk. And they would talk to each other, and then I'd come over and ask them what they had to say, because I wanted them to be thinking about the game, because the way to teach the game is for players to think about the game and reflect on the game. So as a coach, you have to give them space to reflect. And this is at national championships, and so that's what I did. And then we did well, and we got to the next round. And, okay, do I keep doing this? Do I step in? So, what we're doing is fine. What we're doing is working. In the final, the gold medal game, we won the toss, and the player comes over and says, well, what do you think we should do? I said, well, I think you should do whatever you want to do. And then she looked around and realised where the wind was coming from and this and that, and made the right decision. And I was very, very, very relieved, but quietly relieved. But the constraints are there, and we won. And I wrote a blog post about it. I see so many times where someone saw some mediocre junior college coach do lots of laps at training, and then they ended up winning that season, and so therefore that's a good thing, right? So because you won, then everything that you did beforehand must have been correct. My point is that this team won doing this. I'm not saying that it's the answer either. I'm just saying that it works. You can do both. And so as a coach, you actually get to choose that, right? You're the one that's deciding how you behave. You're deciding what decisions you make. And you got to own it. You can't just sit back and say, oh, well, I lost my cool, or, oh, well, I was doing that, but then this became really important to me. So, okay, you got to own it. So, okay, I compromised the long-term development of these children because I really, really wanted to win, and not because they wanted to win, not because their parents wanted to win. But you've got to own it, because it is possible. It just takes some thought, takes some planning, and takes some courage. Definitely takes courage.
Yeah, it's basically tied in with the coaching philosophy stuff Sean Manzi talked about the other night, in terms of, you need to understand where you're coming from as a coach and be able to apply it.
Yeah, the first time I ever did coaching philosophy was it was a session Leskevich ran in, I don't know, early 90s in Australia. And it was an hour-long session. And so just write down everything that you think at the beginning, and you might end up with an entire page of things that you want. And we had an hour to go, and you're going to reflect on this, and you're going to change it, and you're going to do this and that. And I remember at the time writing, my coaching philosophy was to create an environment where athletes could and wanted to thrive. So they could thrive, and it inspired them to continue to get better and better. And that was sort of 15 minutes. I came down with that, and then I'm kind of looking around for the rest of the time. And that hasn't changed a bit since then. So from coaching beach volleyball at the Olympics, to coaching college in the States, to coaching world tour stuff, to being in charge of running coach development programs for completely different sports, it hasn't changed at all. And that's not everyone's philosophy. That's my philosophy. But I think it really has served me well, because it allows you to do lots of things, and also it's about creating an environment. So it immediately, my job is to make something that people want to be part of. So it's not me. It's not my environment. It's something for everyone else. And sometimes I've been better at that than others. But I always get a kick of seeing kids that I've coached, whether they were good or bad, who I see them 10 years later and they're still involved in the sport and they still like the sport. That gives me a huge amount of satisfaction, because I didn't, as I tell them sometimes, I didn't coach the fun out of it.
All right. Well, we've gone a little over an hour. Is there anything that we haven't covered yet on this topic that you want to make sure we get in?
I could keep going for another couple of hours, but that'll do for now.